Hi everyone, welcome to the JCC. I'm Jordan Abel, Arts and Ideas Program Manager, and I'm so happy to have all of you here for a wonderful evening with baking legends Alice Medrich, Emily Luchetti, Rose Levy Beranbaum, and Margo True. Alice, Emily, and Rose's books are for sale this evening, courtesy of Omnivore Books, the Bay Area's only culinary bookshop. I encourage you all to support a local independent bookstore and buy their books tonight. They're going to make wonderful holiday gifts. The authors will, of course, be signing after the talk, and we will have plenty of time for your questions, so think of some good ones. I also want to take a minute to thank Eric Cohen and Justice Grace Vineyards for pouring wine for you before the event. I hope you had a chance to try it. It's really delicious. And we're also in for a treat because Angela Brasinga and Amy Mackneck from Sunset Magazine baked wonderful goodies for you to try during the reception. Yes. And they're recipes from Alice, Rose, and Emily. And there are also going to be wonderful little chocolates courtesy of Cocoa Savvy, so thanks to them as well for providing those. So this lineup this evening is a real dream for me as a home baker. I can honestly say that Alice, Emily, and Rose taught me how to bake through their wonderful detailed cookbooks and websites now. And I'm guessing that I'm not alone, so I just want to take a minute to check in with all of you. Who's made their recipes? Alice, Emily, or Rose? Okay, so we're at 100%, which is amazing and wonderful. And like I said, they'll be taking your questions, so think of some good ones. Now I'll introduce our speakers tonight who really need no introduction. Alice Medrich has won more Cookbook of the Year awards and Best in the Dessert and Baking category awards than any other author. As many of you know, she is the woman who brought chocolate truffles to the US when she began making and selling them at her Berkeley shop, Cocola. Her new book, Flavor Flowers, is an experiment in using alternate flours, teff, buckwheat, sorghum, nut flours, whole and ancient grains, and more. It's full of really spectacular desserts, including some delicious ginger cookies made with oat flour that you'll get to try tonight. Emily Luchetti is Chief Pastry Officer for the Big Night Restaurant Group, which includes Marlowe, the Cavalier, and Park Tavern. She was the pastry chef at Stars, Farallon, and Water Bar, and has written so many wonderful and classic dessert books as well. She's a member of the James Beard Foundation's Who's Who of Food and Beverage in America, and lately has begun a national conversation encouraging us to return dessert to its proper place in our diets with a hope of reducing the diabetes and obesity epidemic we're now facing as a nation. And tonight you'll get to try Emily's chocolate peanut butter squares, which are corn syrup-free versions of what candy bars could only aspire to taste like. I tried them already, obviously. And Rose Levy Beranbaum is the award-winning author of The Cake Bible, which is now in its 50th printing. That's 50. Was named one of the top 13 baking books on the James Beard Foundation's Essential Books list. Her other books have won James Beard Foundation and International Association of Culinary Professionals Cookbook of the Year awards, and her popular blog, Real Baking with Rose, has created an international community of bakers. Her latest book, The Baking Bible, is a definitive, meticulously researched magnum opus of her illustrious baking career, and tonight you'll get to sample her luxury chocolate butter crunch toffee. Alice, Emily, and Rose are joined by Margo True, food editor at Sunset Magazine and one of our favorite moderators. So please join me in welcoming Alice Medrich, Emily Luchetti, Rose Levy Beranbaum, and Margo True.
Well, welcome. Thank you all for coming to partake of this tonight. It's going to be a really sweet conversation, I think. And you know, as I was thinking about our panel tonight, it occurred to me that the first foods that most children make are sweets. They're cookies or brownies or something like that. And for me, it was a Rice Krispies strawberry ice cream pie when I was 7. And then we grow up and we kind of go into a savory path, or we tend to, or a sweet one. And you don't often find people who are equally passionate about both. And so I wanted to start by asking each of you to take just a couple minutes to talk about how you ended up on the sweet path. What led you to be a baker? And Alice, we'll start with you.
I probably didn't think of myself as a baker for many years because it began with the first bite of a chocolate truffle that was homemade by my landlady in Paris in 1970-ish. And I'd grown up on Hershey bars, and and fudge, the American things, and this chocolate truffle was like a revelation. And I literally took that recipe home after begging for it, and walked into the charcuterie that had opened opposite Chez Panisse and said, I make these truffles, will you buy them? And that really changed everything. That truffle led to some chocolate torts, really simple, which I've always considered, too simple to be real baking, and one thing led to another, so there it was.
Oh, that's great. And you opened Coca-Cola in the...
I opened Coca-Cola with that small repertoire that I developed from the charcuterie, and grew that business to multiple units by the time I sold it, and eventually learned all the things about baking that I didn't know when I started. So I was definitely a learn by doing, mostly self-taught pastry chef or baker.
Oh, thank you. And Emily, how about you?
Well, I actually cooked professionally in the culinary side. I'd gone to culinary school and learned the savory side. And I was working at Star's Restaurant in San Francisco, and I was just losing my love for it. I just didn't really wake up every day and want to go in the kitchen and chop 5 pounds of garlic or peel onions. And also when I peel onions, I cry incredibly. So I said, I just can't do this anymore. And I saw the pastry kitchen out of the corner of my eye, and I said, I know that's what I want to do. And my husband kept saying, how do you know? You've been working for 7 years, you're just going to kind of throw it all away. I just said, I know. And I switched. Jeremiah Tower gave me the opportunity to move over to the pastry side, and I just fell in love with it right away. And like Alice, it was kind of all learn as you go, no real formal training, which I think there are pluses and minuses to that. But, it was one of those things that once I started it, there was no turning back.
Oh, nice. And how about you, Rose?
Such a peculiar beginning because my mother was a dentist, so I grew up. I grew up without sweets, and then I tasted my first cake that happened to be from a cake mix, and it tasted too sweet, and it also tasted artificial. Then I tasted my first cake from scratch, and I didn't like the texture, but I loved the flavor, and I thought, wouldn't it be lovely if you could have the texture of a cake mix and the flavor of a scratch cake made with butter? And putting that in the back burner, I ended up through a very circuitous path, going to NYU and getting my degrees in undergraduate and graduate in food, and my master's thesis was does sifting affect the quality of a yellow cake mix? I mean, I still have that cake on the brain, but there were so many aspects and tests that were needed to be done, and this was supposed to be hypothetical. So what happened actually was that this became the Cake Bible, but it took a long time for that to happen because I started working at Ladies' Home Journal in the test kitchen, and the only thing I wasn't allowed to do was the cake because that required being able to do cake decorating, and I couldn't teach myself how to do it. So I signed up for Wilton, and I came back knowing how to pipe. But I thought, why pipe on styrofoam? I want something good to pipe on. Meantime, I thought I would have a French cooking school. I'm a savory cook at heart. I don't like too much sugar. That's why I started baking, because I wanted to decrease the sugar. So I was speaking to Lydie Marshall, who had a very famous French cooking school called à la bonne cocotte in New York, and she said, why would you want to do that? Everybody has a French cooking school. I will send you students if you teach cake decorating. And I thought, I really don't care how it looks as much as I care how it tastes. So what I'll do is I'll let the students learn how to decorate, and I'll do a demonstration on something that's worth decorating. And one of the students his wife was a literary agent, and he asked me to write a proposal to write a cookbook. So one thing led to another, and my first cookbook, which was Romantic and Classic Cakes, came about, and I'd written, and I always overwrite. So this one was 3 times the amount that they could publish. And I thought, I wanted it all under one cover. When the rights reverted to me after it was remaindered with the whole series, it became the Cake Bible, but it became about 20 times the size. And each book somehow is because there's some stuff that doesn't fit into the book before, and so I'm propelled to write the next one.
Oh, that's great. It's
10
sort of
books later.
a self-perpetuating mechanism. Now you're on book. This is your 10th book, the Baking Bible.
That's right.
Oh, that's incredible. Well, all of you have been involved with baking for many, many years now, and really have seen so many changes in your careers. And I wanted to ask you, how has our taste for baked goods as Americans changed in the last, say, 20 to 30 years, or since the inception of your careers? I mean, what is an example of something that you would have proudly served in the mid-'80s that you know just would not go over well today? Emily, how about you?
Well, I think when I first started out working at Stars as a pastry chef, and the whole American regional food thing was really taking off in restaurants, you could put simple, classic American desserts on. People had those at home, but they didn't have them in restaurants. Most of the restaurants you got were, French desserts. So I could put an angel food cake with fresh peaches on and whipped cream, and I was like a goddess. But if you do that today, it's like, they'd say, that's all you got? So it's a little bit trickier, but at the same time, people want those same core flavors. And so it's how do you pull it out and make it more interesting, but at the same time, keep it familiar enough. And I think also the difference is, back then there was probably only one style of desserts or something, but now there's so many different styles, and pastry chefs have become creative in so many different ways that everybody is different. You go to San Francisco and you can go to any of the pastry chefs here, and everyone has their own nuance, their own trick, their own way they do something, and I think that's what's made it really much more exciting. There's so much more diversity.
Yeah, it's not about so much going to a French pastry shop as it is about going to that person's
Right. It's much
pastry
more
shop.
an artistic style.
Yeah. Alice?
Well, my memory of when I opened Coca-Cola, and really I didn't have I was extremely young and hadn't had any kind of career in food, short of delivering these desserts to the charcuterie across the street. My memory was that cakes that you bought in a bakery were tall and fluffy and made with Crisco, and the frostings were powdered sugar, and I'm probably oversimplifying a lot, but I know that what my idea for dessert was entirely different than that. I'd been to France. I'd been also realizing that some of the homey desserts that we all take for granted now, the Queen of Sheba, those little chocolate torts, all of that stuff, which were not the kind of desserts that professionals were making, but really dedicated home cooks, even here at home, because of Julia Child and Simone Beck. That's what we were making and serving to friends who really knew food, and nobody was selling those. So that was my easy way in. It was all about good ingredients and the little bit of skill of putting them together. It was more about flavor than sugar. So I think that some of what we were doing then sort of has moved forward. We like desserts that are not quite as super sweet as they used to be, with some exceptions, of course. For me, it was about more flavor than sweetness. It was about the ingredient. It was chocolate mostly for me. I remember giant food service made cakes during those years that overhung the plate. I remember tons of giant carrot cakes. I remember huge sweet things. And what we were doing here in the Bay Area and what I started at Coca-Cola was so different than that. I can almost not remember what came before. I think there's more savory going into desserts now, which is fun. More salt with the sweet, more balance.
Yeah, I
flavor,
read
less sweet.
I think I read in Bittersweet, one of your books, that a statistic about how in the 1970s Americans bought 70% of the chocolate they bought was milk chocolate, and now it's probably, wouldn't you say, almost reversed? I mean, it's really climbed so much
Certainly
toward
there's
the
more dark
bittersweet
chocolate, but I think we also underestimate that there's a vast portion of the middle of the country that still likes sweeter chocolate. But we also have new milk chocolates that are exciting and darker and more flavorful now than we did back then.
That's
So
true. There's been
chocolate's undergone a huge revolution and changed people's palates quite a lot.
Yeah, and Emily, what would you not serve today that you maybe would have made 25 years ago? Or would you?
In the back of the Cake Bible and in my new kitchen as well, I have the same array of liqueurs, and they're all from about 35 years ago. I used to use liqueurs a lot in baking, never drinking, because I didn't really like to drink them straight, but they were delicious in buttercreams and in cake syrups, and I find I'm just not using that at all anymore, hardly. But what I noticed also is that plated desserts are in restaurants are the thing, very elaborate plating. But see, I've never been a restaurant chef, and I don't go that direction. And I remember when I was a contributing editor to Food Arts magazine, and Ariane Batterberry, one of the co-founders of it, said, "Where is the cake?" You know, I mean, they're cakes and they don't have any cake components. And she said, "Please bring back the cake." So, but basically, as a home baker, I can do that because I don't want to have 5 different components in a recipe, because nobody will want to make them. As it is, they even complain that there are as many components as I have. Somebody wrote about my new book, everything has a component. Well, the cookies don't have a component, you know, but that's the perception people have. So I think people want simpler but better quality.
That's great. And that actually leads into my next question for you, Emily, because you are very involved in the restaurant world. And I wondered if you were seeing any trends going on in restaurant desserts that you think might trickle down into home baking, or that maybe are already starting to.
Well, it's interesting with, we're talking about the birthday cake. I mean, the birthday cake is such a classic, delicious thing. And you don't see it on restaurant menus, where there are a couple places, mine too, one of the restaurants I'm with, we put it back on because nothing is as good as a piece of cake, So, but as far as trends, when you're in the middle of it and you're creating desserts all the time, it gets, and a reporter will call up and say, what's going to be the hot trend this year? You always say, I don't know what to say. And I finally just started looking down at whatever I was doing and saying, chocolate and peanut butter, that's the next trend, because you just don't know. And it is fascinating how things trickle down. I think, all the whole grain things that are happening now, in Alice's book, and a lot of other professional books and have been in restaurants are starting to trickle down. I think that some things go up and some things come down, to the home baker and then back up to the restaurant chef. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I've always wondered whether home bakers are going to catch on to this whole seriously savory trend going through desserts in restaurants, like the steamed parsnip cake at Bar Tartine, and things like that.
I think the savory trend is limited, and I think that it's limited because you have to have a really sophisticated palate to be able to do it well and know when to stop. I think it can be too much of a savory element, and I think that if you're baking desserts for home and you're only serving one dessert, I don't think it's ever going to catch on. Of course, it probably will, and you can say, I told you not to invest in savory desserts, but I don't think that that's ever going to get bigger than it is now.
Okay.
I think there's a huge divide between what goes on in restaurants and what goes on at home. And even if there are some sophisticated home bakers who might do that, if they're serving one dessert to a crowd, you just do not know whether most of your crowd is going to want that parsnip.
Right.
And so I think it's just, I think that even if the baker herself might like that, I doubt that that's the thing that they're going to want to serve.
Yeah.
Except to a very specialized
I think
group
you
of
have
friends.
to differentiate is there's savory elements of dessert, but that has nothing to do with dessert sweetness. Because you can have a basil on a cake, and the cake could be really, really sweet. And so I think if there's any trend at all, that it's towards less sweet. I mean, I think probably for these guys too, we can say, the more I work with desserts, it seems like the less sweet I make them and want them. And sometimes I will have someone taste that and something that I've tried and they go, it needs more sugar, it's not sweet enough, it's not balanced. So I think that there's, if any kind of trend, people, they want sweetness to be cut back because they want more flavor. And that's a really good thing, because if it's too sweet, it masks the flavor and you don't get the intensity.
Well, what about molecular gastronomy? Are any of you dabbling with foam and caviars and things like that? And, and will that ever be something that people do at home? Or
no, I mean, I appreciate
it
it as an artistic thing, and when I go somewhere, if it's done well, I think, oh, that's pretty cool, and I enjoy it. But as far as who I am and my style and my creativity, it just, I just haven't gone there.
No. Either of you? Have you?
I have to say that I got to visit Nathan Myhrvold's lab, and I also was
Seattle.
not
That's
interested.
fascinating.
That is such a turn on.
And I'm
Yeah.
not allowed to say what I.
He's got his convection oven and then a bandsaw right next to each other, you know? And the bandsaw isn't to cut the cake, it's to cut the oven, you know?
Yes.
I really thought I was just going to be looking and be interested, and I'm not allowed to talk about what I saw. So I'll just obliquely say that what they're doing in creating flavors isn't just by using special machinery, it's also by doing things that we wouldn't think to do, that we can incorporate into our home baking. And I think their next book is going to have that. The next book is for the home baker. This will be interesting to see.
Very interesting. Well, you have to tell me later. Quite exciting. Then we live in obviously a very digital age, and given that there are zillions of recipes out there now, how do you all decide what recipes to create? Do you kind of roam around out there and look for the vacuum and decide how to fill it, or what do you do? And then once you've decided what kinds of things you're going to make, how do you go about developing them? Do you work alone late into the night? Do you have collaborators? I'm curious about your creative process, Rose.
I just immediately think of the Queen Amman, which is what's on the cover of the book, of my new book. And that's something that a friend of mine from Germany introduced me to when we were eating at 11 Madison. And he ordered it. I'd never heard of it. And he said, "This isn't up to snuff." And I said, "Well, what is it supposed to be like?" And he said, "You'll have to have the one in Paris." So when I was in Paris, I tried it, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. But I can never do it at home without a sheeter. And after many tests, I think it was
Can you say what a sheeter is for
a sheeter,
people who might not know?
It's like an enormous pasta roller, with a cloth on it, so that you can move the dough back and forth very evenly, and it doesn't get warm by the heat of your hands. So you can do what's called laminated dough, which is like a puff pastry or a croissant. And a Queen Amman actually is a croissant dough, which means it has yeast in it. It's like puff pastry with yeast, but it also has sugar rolled into the layers. And as you start adding the sugar, it starts getting syrupy, and you put it in the refrigerator to cool, and an hour later it's mush. So it took 7 tries, and I just about gave up. And the 7th try, I suddenly had a breakthrough by using a stronger flour that would not break through, and also by putting the sugar in the last 2 turns instead of doing it right from the beginning. And I was really pleased. That was my process of arriving there. But many times I'm always thinking about
patience,
food. I'm always thinking about dessert. So, one day it occurred to me that how can I make ganache more ganache? How can I make it better? And I ended up combining unsweetened, you've probably already done this, but unsweetened chocolate with corn syrup, and it's a great additive because it's the perfect balance of sweetness and glossiness. You can add it to any chocolate thing without changing the basic profile. But then I had at one of the pastry arts events a chocolate that was made with cayenne pepper, and I thought, this is a wonderful addition. And what really blew me away was not just that you could feel it evolve in your mouth, but it was like wine. It had a finish. So after you finished eating it, you kept tasting the chocolate. It carried the chocolate further. So some of the things, in short, are things that come out of my imagination, but I'm influenced by just going around and seeing what's out there.
So it's what appeals to you, not what you perceive a need to be.
No, I don't care what people out there want. I'm sorry. I just hope they care about what I want.
Well, obviously, you know the secrets to what
people
you
always
want is
asking
what
for-
people want.
They're always asking for if I could do no gluten, and I said I already have. I just leave out the flour completely, no problem. I know you have a very different take on it. I'm just saying. I think it takes an expert. I think it takes somebody who really devotes himself, as you have done, to see what is viable and what works. And I've been doing in too many other directions. I have not devoted myself to that. So I can just throw out a gluten-free something with a substitute.
What's your process, Alice?
One of the things I love about doing desserts, making desserts, and writing cookbooks is the problem solving and the opportunity to approach something with kind of a blank slate, open mind. And now that there are so many wonderful flours out there that happen to be gluten-free, and this is because of the gluten-free community, they're all out there, they're available to everyone, so I wouldn't be wasting my time if I'm working on them and want to write about them, because there will be somebody who can buy those flours. I thought, these flours are so delicious, and so interesting on their own, I want to treat them as hero flowers. I want to see what I can do with them in the baking repertoire without thinking always about what we're not using, without thinking in terms of gluten-free. Julia Child used to joke about why we named a cake after what wasn't in it, you know, the flourless chocolate cake, and which then led to quips about the tuna-less chocolate cake. So this latest book, Flavor Flowers, is really about what's in the cake, not what isn't in the cake. So each chapter has a flower. And in order to do that, I had to figure out, because I did choose flours that were gluten-free, because I thought there is a gluten-free market out there that is probably not getting enough delicious recipes yet. I had to figure out how to work around gluten, and I relish that. I mean, I kind of love coming to a problem that way. I like the intellectual problem-solving kind of thing. I like the working with my hands. I like the working with words, and I like making something delicious. So that whole combination thing is really exciting to me. So I come at it with pastry chef skills and baking skills as opposed to dietitian skills and gluten-free skills. And so I look at all these flours and I think, okay, they don't have any inherent structure giving properties, which is what gluten is. And I think, well, I think I will just bake a simple sponge cake out of every one of them and see what they taste like, how they perform, whether I like them, and just see if the eggs will give structure. And so it was a very trial and error kind of thing. I had beginner's luck. Every single one of those genoise that I made was either delicious or almost delicious or pretty good. And it made me think this was going to be a very easy process. And it was a very hard process in the end, because everything I did after that was harder. I worked with a collaborator, thank God, who is very, very smart. And we totally get each other, share a portion of a brain, and then have some skills and problem-solving abilities that the other doesn't have. But it was very much a trial and error experimentation, sort of a process of imagining, what might work, and guessing and trying. Mm-hmm. And I never made so many bad desserts in my entire life in the space of 2 or 3 years, but it was very worth it, because what came out of it, I think, is a whole new view on using these flours, and very satisfying to me.
I have to say, in the January issue of Sunset, we're going to be doing a story with Alice based on desserts that she created, inspired by her new book. And it was really a revelation for those of us at Sunset, too. Because these flours, you chose them not as substitutes for wheat. One of the lines I like in your book best is, imagine a wheat-free world.
Yeah. What might we be baking if we had all these other flours instead? It's a little bit not correct, because of all of our baking techniques are built around the fact that we're either working with or against gluten. So we probably wouldn't be doing these exact desserts, but nonetheless, I used all of that experience in baking to solve a bunch of problems, which I think haven't been approached quite this way before.
Yeah, so problem solving really gets you.
I love it. I love it. I hate it. I love it. I mean, it's I do. I think of it as a problem, and part of the problem is making ingredients taste good, putting ingredients and textures together so that what you get is a sort of a sensory poem kind of thing. So it's not totally the intellectual part of it, but I do love that. I do love that.
And for you, Emily, where do you look for inspiration, and then how do you develop?
Well, I think, sometimes if I go out to eat, like I'll have someone's dessert and I'll say, oh my gosh, that's a perfect dessert. I wish I'd created it. You just want to go and steal it, but you don't. But then sometimes I'll have a dessert that I think is very well resolved and it's just perfectly done, but it's not what I would have done. And so then you say to yourself, what would you do to it? And sometimes you end up recreating something totally different, or sometimes it's just a tweak. I think when I do my desserts, it's kind of like I'm always thinking about desserts. So if I have something new, or I see something different, or I read about something, I just kind of put it in my memory bank, and it just kind of churns around. And then one day, hopefully, it kind of comes to the front as something that's more formulated. When I'm doing desserts, I often think about how all the flavors and the textures are going to go together on the finished plate. And that's not really, as far as presentation, it's more like kind of mouthfeel when all the flavors are in your mouth at the same time. Like the cream of a cake, the cream that goes with a cake, or the texture of a Napoleon or something like that. How those things are going to hit your senses. So that's kind of what I'm always kind of trying to think about and wrap my head around. When I do it, I usually have to do the first part by myself, but when it comes to the actual tasting of it, I need someone else. I just don't, you know, I can guess, but sometimes it's like, well, do I like this because I've been testing it 6 times and I just want it to be over? Or is it, you know, is it really good? And so I don't, it's not that I don't trust my judgment, it's just I need a fresher perspective.
So that's interesting. You're sort of tasting in your imagination.
Right.
Before you actually ever get in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow, that's so great. Would that we all had that skill.
I'm not saying it works, but.
And actually, Emily, your most recent book, The Fearless Baker, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your latest book, because that's all about helping people feel comfortable baking. And you have a very interesting introduction in the book in which you talk about, you know, really asking people why they're so afraid of baking, those who are. And
Nobody here, you wouldn't
nobody
be
here,
here.
of course. And can you talk a little bit about how you went about writing the book? Because you had an unusual process.
Yeah. Well, when I first decided to write a book and really go back to basics, 'cause my other books I thought were simple. I didn't think they were that complicated. But even like my sister-in-law, I gave her all my books, and she loves to bake. Two sister-in-laws, and like they were never baking anything. And she'd say, "Well, do you have a recipe for chocolate cake?" I felt like saying, "It's on page 45 of the book I gave you for Christmas. At least look at it." But then it finally dawned on me that they were very intimidated by just everything about it. It was whether the picture was too beautiful or whatever. So I said, okay, let's take a step back. And then people would say to me, well, I don't bake. I said, well, do you like to follow instructions? And they said, no, I don't follow instructions. And I said, don't use it as the instructions as something that's going to mess you up. Use it as a guideline and a helpful hints to get you to a successful thing. So I really want to kind of demystify, you know, baking. And so what I did was I went to people and said, what are your biggest fears? And a lot of them were the same, but still, so that's when I started taking each one of those and just kind of picked them apart, so then they couldn't say, oh, baking's hard. Because I say, if you're a lawyer, if you can get your driver's license, you know, you can bake. You know, you maybe can't make a Queen Amand the first time, but you couldn't ride a bike the first time either. It's all about practice and just doing something that you want to do and enjoying the process of it.
And what was so neat, I thought, about your book was that you became actually kind of a baking fairy godmother, and you chose all these hapless people who were the fearful bakers, and in your book they're abbreviated as FBs.
Yeah.
And there's this great dialogue that goes down the side of almost every recipe, and it's an exchange between Emily and the FB, and the FB is saying things like, oh, I think I burned the nuts, and Emily will say, oh, relax, you know.
Just don't use them. The
Just
cookie
throw
doesn't
it
need them.
out, and then she'll say something
But
very...
and a lot of those people I had never met before. So it wasn't like they were all good friends or friends of friends. They were, some of them I had never met, and they were just people. And like one guy I baked with, he was very thin, he was very young, he was very attractive. So we make these crepes with roasted fruit, I think it was, and caramel sauce. And we get done, I said, here, have a bite. And he goes, I don't eat desserts. I'm like, your poor girlfriend just made you go through this. But he was having so much fun, and he actually enjoyed the process. And I'm like, get a life and eat the dessert already.
Oh, that's so funny. But then you always end the little dialogue when people are like, you asked this one woman, who wanted to just throw coconut in something in the batter. You said, have you read the recipe? And she goes, oh, no, I just looked at the ingredients. Well, if you read the recipe, you will see that if the coconut is in the last step, and if you put it in now, everything will seize up and clump, and you really should read the recipe. There's always like a very gentle lesson.
I am the worst at that, too. Sometimes, like, you look at a recipe, and you're like, oh, I know how to bake. I can just look at the ingredients, you just start throwing stuff in. Or if they'll say, like, a half a cup of sugar, and they don't say half a cup of sugar divided. So it's like, oh, I know I have to cream the butter and the sugar, so you just start throwing everything in together, and it's like, oh shoot, I didn't read the recipe.
Yeah. But it's just a really, I think, a lovely book to get people in the groove, and they're delicious recipes too. It's not like they're dumbed down in any way. They're truly solid. Then Rose, in your baking Bible, one of my favorite parts of it is Rose's golden rules. And these are like things you should just commit to memory because they will ensure or help ensure your success in baking. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of those golden rules? What are some of these common mistakes you see people making, and what do you tell them? What's on that list?
The one that comes immediately to mind is about the eggs, because I give the volume, the ounces, and grams. I personally use grams and I use weight because I think it's easier, it's faster, it's more accurate and more reliable. But when you use eggs, you have to use one of those methods, at least the volume, because apparently people are using younger laying hens to have eggs in industry, as well as ones that you get from the farmer's market. And I think that sometimes when I call for 5 yolks, I have to use as many as 7 to get the right amount. And since yolks are not just for flavor, but also they're great emulsifiers, they have lecithin, and which means that they more evenly disperse ingredients. It makes a huge difference if you're using much less than the recipe calls for, and therefore much more white than the recipe calls for. So one of my rules is to weigh the eggs or measure the eggs. Probably the most important thing of all, though, is the oven. I always call that the common denominator of failure. When people say that something either burned or something didn't rise right, I always say, did it bake in the amount of time within the range that's listed in the recipe? Because if it takes longer, you can't just say, okay, I'll just bake it longer. It means that the structure didn't set, because the gelatinization of the flour needs a certain heat, and if it's too low, it's going to be it's going to be low and ruin the texture of it. So if your things are not baking according to at least my range or whatever recipe that you're using, you can't necessarily just turn it up. Sometimes you need to have it calibrated. But the oven is a really essential thing. Also, using the right size pan. If you use too small a pan, it rises too much and the whole thing collapses. If you use too small of a pan in a cake, the heat reflects down and it burns at the top. So another problem is that when you go to buy a pan, if you're buying a 9 by 2 inch pan, it may actually only be 8.5 inches at the bottom. Bring a tape measure. I mean, there's so many little simple rules that you don't really have to commit to memory. You just have to read once, and you think, aha, it makes sense.
Yeah, I remember reading years ago in Gourmet a side-by-side comparison of measuring cups and spoons, and they were all different, which is
That's
shocking.
why I like to use the weight, because even if a scale isn't 100% accurate, it's a lot better than using volume. But the challenge in the baking Bible was that I was doing 4 subjects. So there are different rules for pie baking, for bread, for candy and cookies, and for cake.
Wow. Well, I actually thought that your tip about citrus zest was great. One of your golden rules, which is to wash an orange or a lemon with detergent and rinse it.
I didn't invent this. This came from Barbara Trupp. Remember she had China Moon, and it was in her book. And I tried doing it without doing it that way, doing a comparison. And if you don't wash the zest with detergent, it's actually bitter. I mean, I thought I'd be losing all the oils that are in the zest, but she was so brilliant about that.
How
Now
interesting.
we have to go home and do that.
Yeah, I know. I was like, oh, God, try that. And the other tip that I was curious about was to get a nice rounded top on a cupcake, you suggest letting the batter sit in the little liner for 20 minutes before baking.
I know it's kind of counterintuitive, but what's happening is that since you're using double-acting baking powder, what happens is that some of it reacts after mixing it with the liquid, and the rest when it gets into the oven. So if you have some of it dissipate, then it's not going to, basically baking powder not only raises the cake, it also destroys some of the cell structure. So if you put too much in, the cake drops in the middle. So if you let it dissipate a bit by sitting, then you get a more rounded top. Some people want a flat or a level or a dipped one because they want to add more buttercream, but since I really don't want more than a smidgen of buttercream. I mean, it looks very pretty to have that nice top, but who wants to eat gobs of any kind of fat? Well, at least if it's butter, right? So this is a way you can control it. I mean, I can't give a different amount of baking powder for each preference, so I say if that's what you want, just let it sit. If you want it the other way, just don't. Put it in the oven right away.
Well, and Alice, I know that when we were at your house baking the other day, the subject of underbaking cookies came up, and I wondered if you could talk about that and maybe a few other things that you notice people doing.
Well, I think that in general, Americans tend to underbake pastries. The French always joke about that. It's not done in France until it's a little charred on top. But with the flours that I've been using recently, which are not wheat flours, they need, and many of them are whole grains, they need to be properly hydrated, they need to sit and absorb some liquid, and they need to be thoroughly baked and to get a nice toasty flavor and baked at a slightly lower temperature. That doesn't pertain to all baking with wheat, but it does remind me that people either often serve cookies that are underbaked. They're not brown enough, and brownness gives flavor. Brownness is flavor. But that actually steps back to issues about what you're baking on, because people who are baking on dark pans often get a burnt bottom to a cookie that's still undercooked on the inside. So it's like every detail matters in baking. It's crazy, it's nerve-wracking, it's annoying, but it's kind of wonderful. Everything you do makes a difference. It can make a good difference or a bad difference, but every different material you bake on, every different way you mix can all make a difference in the recipe.
And I loved your explanation of, well, your very persuasive argument for not overbeating your egg whites. And I had not realized till that moment that I have always overbeaten my egg whites. I just didn't know. I didn't know that what I produced was dry.
I think that, yes, and then we had that whole language thing, is how do you describe this? I think everybody who bakes at home probably overbeats egg whites, and I think most savory cooks probably do too. The way I've come to envision this is that if in doubt, you should stop, because it's always better to have them a little underbeaten than overbeaten. And my way of visualizing this is that the egg whites are like little tiny balloons, and a properly beaten egg white still has a lot of elasticity around the balloon. An overbeaten egg white is blown up to the max anymore, and it's going to break. And so when you fold your other ingredients into it, and if you can, it's going to be hard to fold them in because they're either breaking or they're not dispersing. And once that batter goes in the oven, you're counting on those little bubbles to grow and expand until the cake starts to set. And if, when they expand, they break right away, you're never going to get the rise that you want. This is not very scientific. It's just my version of my way of imagining what these egg whites are like when they're beaten. So if you're not sure when to stop and you beat them a little less, you stop. It's better if they're a little underbeaten, because that's like balloons with tons more elasticity, and you're likely to get the rise that you want anyway.
As long as it holds a peak when you take the beater out.
Yeah, and then that has to do how stiffly you can beat them without overbeating and overdrying them. Also has to do with how much sugar is being added. Mm-hmm. So an overbeaten egg white is different when you're adding no sugar than when you're adding a lot of sugar. So that's the thing that's hard for anybody baking at home who doesn't do it every single day, over and over and over again, with different amounts of sugar in different situations to know. So that's where I come down to the rule, if in doubt, stop.
Yeah. And just bake a lot,
And the other thing while we're on it, if you ever are folding egg whites into another mixture and you're having a hard time with them blending, in other words, they look like little dry boulders around the bowl, that is the sign of an overbeaten egg white. So next time, beat them less. If you have trouble folding them, they're overbeaten, basically.
Okay.
I think it's safe to say.
Yeah, thank you. Personally, thank you.
And it's amazing how egg whites, they play a part in everything. Torts, mousses, every kind of dessert will be improved if you can beat your egg whites properly.
What do you see people messing? Well, you got to see so many mistakes being made in your writing
well,
of that
it's interesting, in the restaurant group that I just went to work with recently, I'm with 3 restaurants, and one of them we have a real live pastry cook, which is fabulous. But the other 2, I'm teaching savory cooks and sous chefs how to make all the desserts and do the production. And part of me loves it, because it's like part of me just hates it, because they have a different approach. And I think the biggest thing is they just try to rush through everything. And I think, if you're working in production in a restaurant or anywhere in a bakery, you have to work quickly. But at the same time, when you're doing pastry, you have to work quickly, but you have to slow down in your head and long enough that you're really focused on what you're doing and you're just really paying attention. So I can work really, really quickly, but I'm 100% zoned in on what I'm doing. So I'm not over whipping the whites or whatever, or burning the chocolate or whatever. So I think it's really just, it's a focus and paying attention. And obviously if you don't have a lot of experience, you can't talk on the phone, you can't multitask, you have to really just do that one thing.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, that's even true for savory cooking. I mean, you know, that idea that you can do it all at once.
But, you know,
constantly.
Rose's comment was perfect because it's like, well, if the salmon isn't cooking, you just leave it in there for, not done, few minutes more. But it can't do that with a cake or something. You know, it just doesn't work that way.
No, that's very true. Well, we talked a bit about gluten-free baking with your book, Alice, and Emily, I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about, you know, the other big health issue of our time, which is eating too much sugar. And, you know, it's kind of, some might think it's a little interesting that you've taken on the overconsumption of sugar as a personal campaign. On your blog. You have #DessertWorthy, this initiative, which I think is so brilliant. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, explain what that is.
Yeah. Well, you know, we all eat too much. Well, not we. I mean, probably the people in this audience don't eat a lot of processed food. But there's so much hidden sugar in processed food. And you think, you know, I'm having a yogurt with fruit for breakfast. That's really healthy. Well, if you read the back of the label, it's not. So, if we can just all take, and everyone in this country can take the sugar out of processed food and return dessert to a treat and not something you have 3 times a day for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and then you can have dessert. And it was funny when I started this campaign. Robert Lustig, who is a Bay Area scientist who is like Mr. Anti-Sugar, he sent me an email and he's like, I agree with you 100%. He said, you can have your dessert. It's just we just have to return it to the place where it's a treat. And you know, you can't have everything you want at the shoe store. You can't have everything that you want anywhere. It's like, whoever said we could have it all anytime we wanted? So, and I think, as Americans, no one wants to hear no, no, no all the time. So, and it hasn't been successful, all this no, no, no. So let's go no, 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 yes. And you can just have our desserts and no one else's, and that's fine. That's dessert worthy.
I think it's useful for people to know that people like us who do make dessert and live dessert are not eating dessert all day long and not eating dessert necessarily every day. And if we do taste, it's tasting.
Right.
And
Yeah,
tasting's
they don't ask the winemaker if he's an alcoholic,
Right.
you know, or they expect us to be fat. You know, it's just, it's crazy.
So people can you do this campaign on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook.
Yeah, and I've written a couple things on Huffington Post for it. So I'm really getting started. The problem is I'm not tweeting and all that stuff as much as I should because it's just kind of boring, but I have to start doing it. So you guys can all do that and do #DessertWorthy.
Yeah, so the idea is to post photos of things that are dessert worthy, and then you also have not dessert worthy.
Yeah,
not
dessert worthy, like saving it for later. Because you know, when I first started this, people are saying, well, post everything that's dessert worthy, and it's like, well, there are a bazillion things that are dessert worthy. You know, I would like to argue that everything I make is dessert worthy. Sometimes it's not, but so it's kind of like I've started out by saying, okay, don't, you know, cut back, but, you know, now's the time. You can let's just add it in and have some fun.
Yeah, fun. That's important.
And guilt.
To
Guilt is
remember.
so highly overrated. I just don't. Because people say, well, I felt so guilty eating that dessert. Well, first of all, you ate the dessert. Then you feel guilty. You got 2 things you got to get rid of. You know, 1 is the dessert and 2 is the guilt. And it's just like, get rid of the guilt. Either eat it or don't eat it. And move on.
Yeah.
So.
Well said. Well, and you know, so some desserts are worthier than others, but some ingredients are also worthier than others. And I wondered what each of you might be obsessed with right now. If there's any particular ingredient that you just cannot get out of your imagination and that you're working with a lot or want to work with a lot, or Rose, how about you?
Not really.
No. You You just,
I mean,
you
my
like
obsession
your,
was
your
eggs
standards,
because
yeah.
of the way it was behaving. But actually, I know you were going to ask me about disasters, and this is a combination answer because the biggest disaster became a big obsession with me, and that was cornstarch. I was making genoise, and I made a wedding cake-sized one, and it turned into cornbread. And I thought, this is in the cake Bible. Could it be wrong? Nobody's reported that in 26 years. And I remember liking the texture, and I hated it. And I went through test after test of trying to figure out what it was. And finally, we decided to try non-genetically modified cornstarch. And I've been hearing theoretically that genetically modified things are bad, but I really don't like to get into political or, like certain ingredients are the enemy. Because with each book I did with the cake Bible, sugar became the enemy. Then with the bread Bible, suddenly flour was the enemy. And then butter was the enemy with a Christmas cookie book. So I didn't want cornstarch to be
If
an
you
enemy.
write a kale book, kale will become the enemy.
And I wish I could like kale. Then maybe I could do it. The thing is that it wasn't just the cornstarch, it was also, again, the egg yolk. Because that's the one case where a sponge-type cake where I don't separate the eggs. So there was no way of saying use this many yolks and this many whites. And I thought if I start putting another column in for that, people will really think I went off the deep end. So I just said 4 or whatever it was, 7 eggs, and I wasn't getting enough yolk. And this was after the book already had gone to press. It had gone to press. So I said to my editor, would you be willing for the second printing to make an addition, not an addition of separating them, which would have meant redesigning the whole page, but just adding 1 extra yolk, and it makes all the difference. That and the non-genetically modified cornstarch so that's my latest obsession.
Wow. Well,
And
that's
I
a
wasn't
good
even
one.
allowed to mention that because that's too political for a cookbook, so I said be sure and use Rumford or other non-sodium-based cornstarch. No, that's non-sodium-based baking powder, but Rumford or another organic type of cornstarch. And that way, I think people will be warned away from it.
Yeah, fascinating. Well,
One little ingredient. I mean, there's so few ingredients, basically, that make up the repertoire that if any of them is different, as you were saying, it just affects everything.
yeah.
Everything affects everything. I mean, I even made the same bread, double the amount, exactly weighing each loaf and shaping it the same in 2 different pans, both metal. And the oven spring was different, and the shape was different, and the texture was different, and they were both metal pans. So you just can't standardize things unless everything is the same, and it never is. I mean, they say in flour, from one harvest to the other, there is going to be a slight difference in the protein.
Yeah, it is.
It's mind-boggling that we ever make a recipe that anybody can make.
Yeah,
If we truly think about all the things that went wrong, we'd just not do it.
So you wonder why people are afraid of baking.
Okay, yeah, really.
How's it going to turn out? Yeah. Well, as far as ingredients, any come to mind?
I'm still, this book has just come out, and I'm still thinking it and rethinking it and thinking about what's next to do with these flours. I'm still pretty obsessed with all of these flours. I should say I do eat wheat. It's not that I've gone off wheat, it's that I view these as new ingredients that haven't been used in a whole lot of different ways, and certainly not in dessert. So I'm still inventing and reinventing recipes in my head, if not in the kitchen, because I've been traveling a lot. With these flours, and I probably will continue to for a little while.
Well, there's so many surprises in the book. I had no idea that teff would be good with chocolate, for instance. And your brownies are, fantastic. These chocolate and teff brownies, they're wonderful.
I love seeing ingredients that we typecast in a certain way. A lot of these whole grains we maybe find in breads and things, and I love to bring them over into dessert and see what they will do. And I think using a flour that we're used to, maybe a chewy texture or a hearty texture or a bready texture, and turning it into something fine and light actually gives you access to its flavor in a whole different way. Changes the perception of flavor, and that to me is really, really new and exciting.
And Emily, are you in a groove in any particular direction?
I've noticed lately that I start getting really excited about some seasonal fruits right at the end of the season. And it's like, I get real excited. It's like, I'm going to do this. And it's like, no more raspberries. And then I have to wait till next spring. And if I'm lucky, I can still remember what it was that I wanted to do. So sometimes I find myself, playing catch up or one step behind. But You know, I think this time of year it's like caramel.
I was going to ask you if it was blueberries.
No,
like right
no.
now or something,
It's
or
just
plums.
caramel, and like I'm constantly trying to think of things that you can do with caramel, because caramel is one of those things that goes with everything. It goes with fruits, it goes with chocolate, it goes with, you know, anything. And so,
Lamb.
but the what?
Lamb.
Exactly. So I think I'm always obsessed with caramel, and especially this time of year, you can, you know, it's kind of the flavor.
I know,
But
it's-
I've never had a pumpkin caramel latte. And it's not because of the Starbucks or anything, but it's just like, I don't want that stuff in my coffee.
I don't
I
want
want it
that
in my
stuff in my
dessert. I want my coffee without any sweetener or anything.
How did coffee become dessert? I mean,
Yeah, no, and caloric and all that.
Oh, yeah, inflated. Well, we've talked a little bit about techniques and some about ingredients, and I wondered if you could talk about some of the tools that you like to use that people may not necessarily know about, little, you know, things that you love that you rely on over and over. And I'm thinking, Alice, just because I've been to your house, that
I
funny
brought it,
little,
and it's in my purse in the other room.
it's this the funny little spatula.
Oh, the spatula.
Oh, no, you were talking
I'm
about
that pan grabber
the
thing.
pan grabber. That was
Yeah, no,
great.
this thing, I bought this in France for 5 francs when the French had francs,
That's it.
and in the bottom of the BHV department store. And it's this handy little thing that's like a little claw that will grab a pan, and you can use it to slide a pan out of the oven, to poke it with a toothpick or whatever. It's the thing that prevents your hand in the oven mitt from making a giant thumb hole. And it does many other things, and it's held up all of these years. And so I have that, and I'm very old school. I don't have a lot of toys and
You
tricks.
should start selling that.
Well, you know, they
recreating
are online as pizza grabbers. They're
Oh,
pizza pan grabbers here, and I found them. So, yeah. And also, I have, the only other thing I have that I love that Margo saw is this cheap little plastic spreader thing. It's like a mayo spreader, but I don't use it to spread mayo. I use it to get cakes out of pans without scratching the pan and without scarring the cake.
Instead of a thin metal spatula, it works
Instead of a thin metal
just as well for you,
because it
yeah.
slides, you can push it against the side of the cake pan and prevent scratching and prevent tearing the cake.
Is it plastic or metal?
It's plastic. It's $1. They wear out. I buy a new one. They get stained. I buy a new one. It's very low tech.
You buy one at a time? You don't
No,
buy
I
like
buy a
half a dozen?
few.
I was going to say, I think I buy like that.
I'm just a home cook now. But we used to have piles of them in the bakery at Coca-Cola because that was the thing you got cakes out of pans with.
Yeah.
You should get some.
I know, I want one. Where'd you get it? Don't tell, there's going to be a run, and by the time I get there, they're going to have all bought them all out.
Can I say? Because I remember you told me.
Sometimes I see them at Sur La Table, sometimes at King Arthur's site. Wherever I see them, I grab some.
Yeah. What about you, Rose? I also remember something you had
I am
mentioned.
such a tool junkie.
Okay.
I saw something online, and I asked the person to send it to me. I said, if this is as good as I think it will be, I promise I'll write about it. And I always hate doing that because sometimes it isn't, and then they go after me. But this is called Crackum. And
Crackum?
I think it's to crack eggs. Now, his wife is pregnant, and she wanted 20 egg omelets, and he was cracking them on the edge of the pan, and then the white was running off. And so he started thinking about what would be the ideal way to crack an egg. And it's just this oval plastic with a little sharp ridge that rises up about 1 inch wide. And you can hit the egg pretty hard, just about as hard as I would want to, and it never can penetrate the yolk. And so instead of doing it on the counter or doing it on the side of a bowl, which is even worse, this is done right on this little crackum, and then you open it, either separate it, put the whole thing in. It's neat, and it never breaks. So I was thinking, for teaching kids, this is one of the biggest things that they have problems with. They're so afraid. And even I myself, when I'm cracking eggs, I'm thinking, am I going to break the yolk? And what if the yolk is a little old? I mean, when the egg is old, it tends to break into the white. This solves the whole problem. So he was in a Kickstart project, and I put on the blog, please contribute, because I don't want this thing to die. And then I sent $25, even though he sent me one for free. And he's now made it into the production, and he's sending me a gold-plated Crackum. Plus a T-shirt that says Crackum. And I said, but I want one extra word added. And he wrote, what? And I said, up. So if you go online and put in Crackum with a hyphen, you'll find it. Great stocking stuffer. I'm not paid to do this.
Oh, that's great. Any favorite tool for you?
No, I mean, I kind of an old-fashioned, rubber spatula, stainless steel bowls, because they're just, you can put them in the refrigerator, you can put them over a bain-marie, to make a bain-marie, like a little mini offset. A good whisk. It's funny, I'll go into a store and they'll have 20 different whisks, and I'll go, none of these are any good. It's just, it has to have the right heft, it has to have the right wiggle, can't have too much, can't have too little.
And it's individual too, right?
It
It has
is,
to fit
very.
your hand, just
Yeah.
like a knife. Yeah. Huh. Well, and then I think I'm going to ask you one last question and then open it up for Q&A. Between the three of you, you've written really more than 24 books about baking, thousands and thousands and thousands of wonderful recipes. And I wonder what motivates you to keep on doing this. You had mentioned earlier, Rose, that, apparently your cookbook spawned other cookbooks without you even having to
The
to
entire
do
wedding
very
cake
much,
chapter had to be cut from this book in order to make it the size that I wanted it to be and not charge $100 for it. So I guess it's going to be a wedding cake book because of that.
Okay. So just in the process of writing, you always have a lead for your next book,
Yeah,
pretty
the thing
much.
is, though, I've covered every subject I can think of. I think what Alice is doing is really fascinating. But I'm going more in the direction of Emily because people do perceive my books as difficult. Once they make the recipe, if I can get them to do it, they see all the information is there. And they stop writing to me about other people's recipes that don't have all the information. So I'm really tempted to do a book that's much more basic.
Yeah, well, it is, when you're writing a recipe, you have to give enough information, but you can't give too much, because if you give a half a page on how to butter a pan, you're going to lose them. But it's a really fine line between too much and too little, and that's where I think where a really good recipe shines and shows is when you have enough information. And it's really difficult because everyone that reads that recipe has a different level of skill.
That's
A
right.
different, personality. So.
Yeah. When I first got to Sunset, julienne was perceived as being a little outré and a little too French, so we say matchsticks for that
Yeah.
reason. You have to know your audience, in
Yeah.
other words. But yeah, and Alice, what kind of keeps you
I
this-
love the challenge of trying to look at something differently. I haven't done that in every single book. I did it with the low-fat book. That was hard. A low-fat book in an era when low-fat meant all sorts of weird substitute ingredients. I wanted to do it with real butter and real eggs and real good chocolate and just have a different perspective on it. That was very thrilling and challenging. This, because it's done in a new way with new ingredients, I love that. I also have, over the years, since my first book came right out of the pastry shop, came right out of Coca-Cola. It had many, many elements and components, and it was very much geared to a project kind of baking or a professional. And I've gotten simpler since then because I really am at home, baking at home, thinking more about what it's like to be at home. Maybe my version of Emily's Fearless was the Sinfully Easy book, which was, again, an attempt to say, yeah, you can do this. I did it in a different way. It was a way of finding recipes I've always thought were simple and making it clearer that they were simple in some way, and sometimes re-engineering them a little to make them even more streamlined, but still good, or maybe better. But I just love all the parts of figuring out new ingredients or something like that. Not every book, it's too hard, but every now and then a really big, bunch of problems to solve.
So in other words, more books in the future from all of you. We hope. We really hope so.
Don't know.
You never know.
Well, with that, we'd love to hear from you all. If there's problems you've been having in your baking or just general questions.
First question is on your left.
It's easier to see this one.
I suddenly
Hi.
started being able to see.
First of all, I'd like to thank Alice and Rose for giving me the courage to bake wedding cakes. And Alice, it was your article in Bon Appetit, was it 30 years?
1982.
82. That was the first, that was the
memory
first
retention.
wedding cake I made. And I've made a lot since then, including both my children's. But my question is, in our family, we don't have gluten intolerance, we have lactose intolerance. Do you guys have any suggestions about how to make wonderful desserts for
Clarified
people who are
butter.
lactose intolerant?
Do you realize that clarified butter doesn't have any lactose in it? A lot of people don't. And there's so much you can do with it. You can even make pie crust.
Also, is your lactose intolerance include butter, or is that over the line into acceptability?
It's over the line.
You do eat butter, so it's mostly about the other dairy ingredients, the milk?
No,
and-
it's also the butter.
Oh, it's also butter. So what Rose is saying is correct, and sometimes you need to add back a little water. If you have clarified butter and you're using a recipe that calls for butter, you might need that little extra water. Use a little less clarified than the butter is called for, and a little tiny bit of water. And that'll take care of the butter part of the recipe.
Yeah, because the
Correct.
butter oil is 100% butter,
Right.
whereas butter is water and milk solid. So
Right,
you can't just give the equivalent amount of the clarified butter. But you
Right.
just take the full amount of butter, clarify it, and then add the water that might be
Add
missing.
the water that might be missing. And a lot of the non-dairy milks actually work. I haven't tested that across the board, but I think in a lot of cases they do. Anybody?
The almond milk. And also there's a cream that's supposed to be real cream, but somehow acceptable. I don't know how they do it, but I've heard it's good.
Chocolate cakes made with milk can often be done with water, and actually will turn out more chocolatey.
Next question is over here to your right.
Hey, Alice. It's Celia over here.
Oh.
Hello.
Hi, Celia.
I know that one of your other obsessions, at least as of last year at this time, was percentages of chocolate being delineated in cookbooks.
Yeah,
and I
that's
was
a
wondering
big
if you
one.
could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, up to a certain point in this country, all the chocolate that was called for, all the bittersweet and semi-sweet chocolate that was called for in recipes was basically the same chocolate with slightly more or less sugar. So it didn't matter. They were interchangeable. It didn't matter if recipes called for chocolate by percentage or not. But since about 2000, or since the post-Scharfenberger era, almost all the companies now are making chocolate with different percentages, and the percentages of pure chocolate in those chocolates vary from about 55% all the way up to 100%. So what that means is that you can't trust these names, bittersweet and semi-sweet, anymore. They just don't mean anything. So my pitch has been to try to encourage all of us who write and create recipes using chocolate to say what we used, or give a little percentage range so that people can buy the right chocolate for the recipe, so that the recipe will work properly. Because, for example, if my recipe calls for 8 ounces of bittersweet chocolate, and I don't tell you whether that bittersweet is 55% or 70%, and you use the other one that I used, you're most likely going to have a recipe that doesn't work, a product that doesn't turn out well. Even if you bought better chocolate than I did, even if you paid 3 times the amount for the chocolate you bought, if you didn't use the chocolate at the right percentage, you're going to have usually an unhappy surprise. So I've lately taken to try to convince our side of the fence to be publishing that way, because I don't think that people shopping for a recipe are going to know what to do if the recipe in the first place doesn't call for the chocolate or the right percentage. So
I do it.
I do.
Higher butter and fat and higher chocolate percentage is not necessarily a good thing.
Right, exactly.
I totally
Yeah.
agree.
The next question is in the back.
Hi. First, I want to thank all of you for being here, and Rose especially. I learned how to bake from the Cake Bible and never looked back. And I compare all of their books to yours. So my question, Margo touched on this earlier about writing in the digital age. So how do you balance what goes online versus what goes into a book, and then also gets perpetuated in other people's blogs, unfairly or fairly?
Boy, have you opened up a can of worms. It's a real problem. I think already 25% of my book is out there, and probably more every day. But I think people still want to have it all under one cover. My problem is that people put it out, like, I don't want to mention which paper, but just yesterday somebody wrote that they were really furious at me because my apple pie was in one of the papers in California, and it was a total disaster because of the crust. So I immediately asked the publicist to send me exactly what they had sent out and exactly what the paper did. And not only did they leave out all the weights, but they didn't say how I measured the flour. So I do it by gently spooning it into the cup. Now, if somebody does a dip and sweep method where they dip the cup in and sweep it off with a level thing, they're going to get maybe 1.5 times the amount of flour. And of course, it'll be a dry and crumbly crust. So I'd rather people, if they're going to steal from me, at least represent me accurately. There's really very little control that we have now. I mean, if it's out there, it's going to be out there. We just, don't you agree?
Yeah, I don't know what we do. I mean, I don't.
We just hope that people want to have all the beautiful pictures. And a lot of people, even though they can get the ebook and work from it more easily, they really love having the book. They like even the smell of the pages and the feel, to have a solid book. I hope books never disappear completely.
And to yeah.
I'm actually amazed that people will say, oh, I got this recipe off the internet. Like they expect every recipe off the internet is going to be a good one. So I say, well, what was the source? Because usually, I mean, if we had to go to the internet for a recipe, you could look through, see who it came from and figure out if it was going to work or not. But they just say, oh, I don't know. It didn't work. And then they're surprised, you know.
Somebody just wrote it up late at night. And there it is.
There it is.
And repeat it over and over again. The recipes that don't work appear over and over and over and over again. So if you aren't fussy about what sources you're getting it off the internet, most of those recipes are not very good.
Next question is up here to your right.
Hi, good evening. I've been baking for years, and I still don't understand when someone says to cream the sugar and the butter because they never tell you how many minutes. And so over the years, you kind of learn to eyeball it, but you never know if it's going to come out. And sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not. So when is the right time? How much time do you spend on creaming the butter and the sugar?
Depends on what you're making.
Yeah.
I don't cream the butter and the sugar.
Depends
so
on
I
your
can't-
mixer. Depends on your mixer, because low on one mixer isn't going to be low on another mixer.
But some authors actually tell you what you're looking for, which I think is very helpful. Like when you cream butter and sugar, there gets to be more air into the butter, so what would start off as yellow becomes more and more toward the ivory.
One of the things I discovered with cookies a long time ago is that most recipes do call for creaming the butter and sugar, and they don't tell you how long, and most people cream the butter and sugar quite a long time. So I did this little side-by-side thing, and I made the same butter cookie with butter that was creamed for a long time till it was very, very fluffy, butter that was creamed sort of a medium amount of time, and butter that was just barely creamed until it was smooth and well incorporated. And the cookies that came out from the barely creamed butter were better. So it taught me to specify, mix the butter and sugar just until smooth and creamy.
Yeah, because if you cream too long,
You
the
get
butter
air
starts
and
getting
it's cakey and-
it starts melting or getting too soft, and then it behaves differently. It gets absorbed.
So I think if
into
it's a
it.
cookie, do it less.
Usually less.
Yeah, cake,
usually
do it
less,
a
and
little bit more,
sometimes
'cause you
even
want volume.
Yeah, volume in a butter cookie sometimes gets you a more crumbly, cakey texture rather than a sort of how do I describe it? A nicely crunchy, buttery flavor. It affects the flavor too. In a cake, over creaming will break down. You have to do a certain amount if you're doing that style to get some air in there, but not so much that it breaks down. And then the temperature of the butter is going to matter too.
So we made you more
So we
confused.
made you more
than
confused.
we have the last
That's why you're afraid of baking.
Next question in the back.
Hi, I was wondering if you could each talk about your experiences as women in the cooking field, both starting out and then the changes you've seen, because I know Joyce Goldstein often talks about the West Coast was more favorable to women than the East Coast.
I started a bakery when I was about 26 years old, and I'd never worked in another place, so it was my place. So I didn't have the experience of being a woman in a man's kitchen. I only had the experience of teaching my vendors that I meant business and that I should be taken seriously, and that wasn't really hard to do. So I didn't have I didn't have the problems of having to come up in a professional kitchen. That's what you get when you start your own business. It's your show. I learned early on that any equipment dealer who didn't take me seriously didn't get my business, and any equipment dealer who didn't think it was funny if I didn't know what something was called, and who would tell me what it was called and why it was important and how to choose it, that's the person who got my business over years and years and years. And so I think I had a great time in the kitchen. I had a not a bad time at all being a woman in a business early on.
I think San Francisco has always been an eclectic kind of group of individuals. And, you know, in the cooking world, it's unlike New York, where it came from a more European tradition. So when I worked at Star's restaurant for many years, I don't know if any of you had been there or whatever, being a woman was not one of the most outlandish things in the kitchen. We just had such a strange cast of characters, you know. And maybe there weren't as many of us, but working with Jeremiah, he was just, it was like you were there because you were doing a good job. And so, no, it wasn't really even noticed, or no one really paid attention to it. And it's funny because I have to look back and say, oh, you're right. You know, now I'm working with two women that own the company. They're both in their 30s. Like, oh, wow, I haven't really worked with women as colleagues. You know, I've had a lot of women work underneath me, for me, but not as my colleagues. But I really had to kind of stop and think about it, and I feel very fortunate about that.
Well, I'm from the East Coast, and I heard that women who worked in restaurants did have difficulties, but I had two different situations. One was that my mother was a dentist, as I mentioned, and she was the only woman in the entire dental school. So it never occurred to me that a woman would be treated differently. And the other problem, well, not a problem, but the other situation is that I found very early on that I couldn't work for other people. So I also
male or female.
So when somebody asked me that she wrote a book called Boss Lady, and I bought it, we were all standing in line to get it, and she asked each person if she was a boss lady, and then wrote the response in her book. And when she came to me, I said, I'm my own boss, but I give myself a hell of a time.
Next question is also up here in the back.
Hi, I too want to echo the thanks to all three of you. It's because of the work that you've done that I've brought a lot of love to a lot of people in my life through my baking. So my cake Bible right here. My question for you is, today, what do you think it takes to make a successful retail bakery, either from your experience or just in the bakeries you walk into? How do you know this is a place that you like and is going to make it in today's world?
Quality.
Quality, and probably things that you can eat all day long, which means bread as well as pastries.
Yeah, I think. And there's so many pastry chefs I know that say, well, I'm going to open a bakery, I'm not going to do any savory food. And it's kind of a badge of honor. When I was thinking of opening a bakery, that's exactly how I modeled it, because you don't want to do that. But there's that big gap of a day when people want savory food, especially even if it's just to put something in their stomach before they have dessert. And it's a big revenue point too, so you have to be really careful not to ignore it.
Right, and you want frequency, and if people are treating dessert just as dessert, they're not going to be coming in every day.
Yeah.
You
know? But I think it's quality and consistency, and and being in the right spot. You know, location has a lot to do with it. I mean, 5 years ago in San Francisco, we didn't have that many bakeries. Now, thank goodness, there's so many of them around. It's really exciting and fun.
I remember when Food Art sent me to the Bay Area because they said that the West Coast started the bread revolution, but they lagged behind in pastry, and they noticed, maybe this was more than 5 years ago, that a lot of good things were happening. And they sent me to 7 different bakeries to ask a whole row of questions. And then the end result, they named it High Tide in the Bay Area bakeries. But for me, a bakery that would be successful, and I've never had one, but it's someone that can make something that you can't get anywhere else, and you get addicted to, and you just want it again. I remember feeling that way about Alice's when I discovered Coco Latte, and I couldn't believe that something was that good, and I knew I could never make it. But on the other hand, if you can't, even if you give out recipes, people can't necessarily make it exactly how you would do it. So I think you can tell all your secrets and still have a successful bakery because they want to come to have what you have done.
We're going to take one final question in the back.
Thank you so much for helping shape the baking world. I wonder, with Thanksgiving just around the corner, if you might want to share something especially exciting that you're either making or bringing.
Not pumpkin pie.
I make my mother's apple crisp, which is really easy to make, and you don't have to even peel the apples. And it's just got a topping, no two crusts, so there's nothing at all fearful or difficult about it. And I'm probably making the pumpkin and buckwheat bread from my new book, and I may be making the sorghum pecan tart from my new book, with sorghum in the pecan mixture and a sorghum flour crust.
Well, actually, I'm making what your people from Sunset Magazine are making, or have made rather, butterscotch toffee, because I have the kind of family that actually competes as to who gets to make the pie. So I've stepped back and I let the next generation have the glory.
I'm going to make actually probably pumpkin steam puddings. I'm going to make, I like pecan tarts and pies, but they're too sweet, and I think that's why often you see chocolate added to it. But I'm doing, one of the recipes I have at one of the restaurants, it uses treacle, which is a golden English syrup. And when in a traditional treacle tart, which is British, is very sweet. So I added coffee to that. So I'm thinking of adding coffee to my pecan. And I use like the inexpensive instant coffee with the, with the granulars. And so when you mix it in, some of it melts and some of it doesn't. So when you bite it, every once in a while you get more of a coffee hit, and then other times you don't. So
Where's
and
the
whipped
recipe?
Cream. Yeah,
Sounds
I'll give it
great.
to you. But the thing, I actually read it recently about a tradition in a family where they have pumpkin pie for breakfast on Thanksgiving. And I love that, because so much after Thanksgiving you're so full and you're just making room for the pie. If you have it, that's the beauty about dessert, is you can have it when your palate's clean and you can really taste everything. I thought, I'm gonna have dessert on Thanksgiving morning.
But see, this is why I made the butter crunch toffee, by the way, because it has chocolate on both sides.
Right.
And even when you're totally full, somehow you can
still eat
always
that.
eat chocolate. Plus, you can break off a little piece.
And it's just a little bite of something.
Yeah, plus it keeps for a month. So you don't
Yeah,
have
that's
to
even
think
better.
it's all going to be dead the next day. You might have to eat it now.
Or you can make it now.
Actually, my best Thanksgiving memory was when we'd all go back down to my mother's, and she would have been baking pies for days, way more pies than we needed for Thanksgiving, because we were going to hang around for several days. And the idea since childhood was that we got to eat pie for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and before bed for as many days as those pies lasted.
As there was pies left.
And so, it was all bets were off about rules and stuff. We just pie, and then the next morning some more pie. So.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for teaching us.
Thank you.